Good morning. My name is Jeff Adams, and if you're not familiar with me, I hang around here, but I am a certified lay speaker in the tradition of the United Methodist Church, which means that when pastors go on vacation, they can call on us and we can fill in, and I know that's useful to the pastor, but I just want to share with you guys how much I appreciate that you let us do that, because it's good for us too. It gives us an opportunity to practice our discipleship, whether it's myself or John or any of the other ones. And right now, down at this very moment at the Wells United Methodist Church, our own Andrew Bittner is doing a similar activity down there, so keep him in your prayers this morning as well. I attended an event called Christmas at Christ Chapel a few weeks ago. It's where Gustavus does their grand presentation of their choral music and orchestra and liturgical dance, and it's just this huge inspirational thing. And I knew I had this sermon coming up, and I was sitting at that service, and at about the time I sat down and they started playing, the orchestral music started to swell, and I started to really get some nifty ideas about what I could do for this sermon. And I started writing them down on the program furiously. And then it would sort of pass, and then a little bit more time would pass, and all of a sudden I go, oh, perfect, and I started writing down some more ideas. And Paulette was concerned because I wasn't paying attention to the music. So I got this whole thing written down, and I thought it would be a really good thing that I could massage into this message this morning. And yes, ma'am? I can move it away from my mouth. See? Guidance. And that's exactly what is that better? Can you hear me? Okay, thank you. It's kind of buzzy. Don is on it. And this is my point. We went to that restaurant after that moment of inspiration at Christ Chapel, and I kind of shared with Paulette what the notes were for the sermon, and she looked at me and I looked at her. I trust her for guidance more than really anybody in this world. And she said, you can't say that. And I said, well, yeah, but don't you see? And I see, but no. So I didn't use that. I didn't use that material. And I didn't show her this one. Because I don't have that kind of time. And she might say no. So we'll see how that works out for me. But this is one of my favorite Sundays. It's starting to become one of my favorite Sundays. It's the Sunday right after Christmas. It's right before the new year. All the pastors desperately want a break, and so I've given the Sunday after Christmas sermon, I think, every year for about 4 straight years now, whether it's here or down in Wells, and I think one time down at Good Thunder. And it's a unique Sunday. A lot of you have been to church 3 times in the last week, if I'm not mistaken, or some maybe a little bit more. And some of you, Leslie, I'm looking at you, you've been to more than one church in the last week. So you've gone to church 4 times in the last week, right? So we're all here on this Sunday where a lot of folks say, 2 is pretty good. But you're still here, and I really appreciate that. But it's an important Sunday because we're right on the edge of one of those arbitrary lines that we set up that divides things. And that line is the new year. So we're thinking about ways we can do better. We're thinking about what we should give up, what we should keep, what we should resolve to do. And the thing is, for the last 2 months, the entire culture has been talking about nothing but Jesus. Sometimes indirectly. We saw Santa holding the baby Jesus during a sermon and thought, well, maybe that not so much. But the fact of the matter is, the reason they're getting excited about Christmas is because of Jesus. So indirectly or not, leading right up to that edge of the new year, we're all thinking about Jesus. And what a neat thing to think about as we look at that dividing line. And now really, New Year's Day and New Year's Eve is no more special than any other day of the year. I mean, the earth transits the sun about once a year. What a coincidence, by the way. And we choose to mark off that day as special, which is good, even though we could really mark off any day. So I was preparing for the sermon, I was thinking about the new year, and that led me to think about a short story I read recently. And the title of that story is Rome, Sweet Rome. And it poses one of those theoretical questions that you hear every now and again. And the theoretical question at the heart of that story is this. If you took a Marine Expeditionary Unit, okay, 2,100 Marines formed into what we call a heavy battalion. If you took a Marine Expeditionary Unit, it's totally equipped and ready to go fight anywhere in the world for 6 months. If it were transported back in time to 26 BC, could it overthrow the Roman Empire? Okay, so that's the question of this story. Now, they would have a 6-month resupply of fuel, food, and ammunition, but just to keep the scenario fair, they would not have their attack jets and they wouldn't have their helicopters, their attack helicopters. They get to keep their transport aircraft. So you've got 2,200 Marines up against.
Pause for a minute. This will be clear.
You can speak freely amongst yourselves. Check. Better? Worse? Anybody? Thank you, Don.
Yep.
And the heroes in the tech booth. So, could a Marine Expeditionary Unit, a modern Marine Expeditionary Unit, transported back in time to 26 BC, overthrow the entire Roman Empire? Now, that puts them up against the legions of Caesar Augustus. And that's a name you might be familiar with this time of year. Caesar Augustus was the Roman emperor who decreed that the entire world should be counted and taxed. Caesar Augustus was the Caesar that Jesus referred to when he said, "Render unto Caesar that which is Caesar." So the time frame we're looking at is just before the birth of Christ. Now, 66 legions were in place at the time of Augustus, and each one of those has 5,000 of the ancient world's best trained men, for a total of 330,000 Roman legionnaires up against 2,000, roughly, of some of the best trained soldiers that have ever existed, the United States Marines. Now, quick check. Do we have any Marines here today? No, we have one. Any other members of the Marine Corps? Okay. Do we have any Roman legionnaires? I ask because you can still join both outfits. The guys up at the mall will help you out on the Marines, and there's a reenactment group that reenacts a Roman legion somewhere in the Midwest here. You could Google it. You could still become either one of these. But, so you have 330,000 legionnaires spread out throughout the empire. They're armed with spears and shields. They have some heavy weapons. They have siege weapons. They have the catapults, things like that. They're some of the best engineers the world has ever created, now or then. They're not stupid, and they also have a pretty good supply of mounted cavalry. Up against that are these 2,200 Marines. Now, a Marine Expeditionary Unit can go anywhere for 6 months. It's got its own factories that it takes with it for purifying water, reverse osmosis units. It's got laptops that are loaded with every language in the world because they never know where they're going to go. So even though they're in 26 BC, they might have a little bit of an edge on the language. Latin, I don't know about. They might not have Latin. They might have priests in the chaplain corps that would know Latin. They have 6 M1 Abrams tanks. They have 8 artillery pieces. They have numerous transportation trucks. They have guided anti-tank missiles. They have the full complement of the most modern equipment that you could give them. So, boom, they're back in ancient Rome, 26 BC. Could they overthrow the Roman Empire? So Popular Mechanics, upon seeing that story, pulled up some experts on Roman history, and they pulled up some military experts, and they actually kind of gamed the whole thing out. And what do you think they concluded? How many people think the Marines could do it? Anybody? Okay. Romans? The conclusion was that the Marines could put up a really good fight. But the fact of the matter is, when they ran out of gasoline, when they ran out of ammunition, they're up against 330,000 troops. Now, those troops are spread throughout the empire. You can't just pull a legion out of Germania and expect Germania to stay calm. I mean, those troops are there for a reason. But the bottom line is, at the end of the day, they probably couldn't do it. It would simply be too few up against too many, no matter how well equipped they are. So my question is, well, what would it take? All right, let's just play this out a little bit. If we wanted to overthrow the Roman Empire at the time of the birth of Jesus, what would we send? I mean, do we need to send more troops? Do we need to see to it that they're better resupplied? Was it a mistake limiting them so they can't have their attack planes? What would you send if you wanted to do that? How much power would you throw at that problem? Well, the simple fact of the matter is that God, in this very moment of time, chose to use a baby. God, given that same problem, sent the most vulnerable thing that earth produces. There's very few things on this earth. Almost anything else that is born capable of dealing with the environment around it to a certain degree. Human babies, human infants, are one of the things that can't do that. God, when presented with all the evil and oppression of the Roman Empire, sent an infant. I wouldn't. And we should pause for a moment and be thankful that it wasn't up to me. I don't think that way. But God sent an infant. And here's what I want us to note today. We're here celebrating the fact that God chose to do it with a baby. But it's not because he didn't choose a baby because he lacks for firepower. That wasn't his only option. And there's something in Matthew 26. Now we're going to skip way ahead from the Christmas story. And this is when Jesus is actually being confronted by Judas, and he's about to be taken prisoner. It's Matthew chapter 26. I'm going to start reading in verse 47. We'll back up a little bit. While he was still speaking, Judas, one of the 12, arrived. With him was a large crowd armed with swords and clubs sent from their chief priests and the elders of the people. Now the betrayer had arranged a signal with them. The one I kiss is the man, arrest him. Going at once to Jesus, Judas said, "Greetings, Rabbi," and kissed him. And Jesus replied, "Do what you came to do, friend," or "Do what you came for, friend." Then the men stepped forward, seized Jesus, and arrested him. And here's the interesting part. With that, one of Jesus' companions reached for his sword, drew it out, struck the servant of the high priest, cutting off his ear. "Put your sword back in his place," Jesus said to him, "for all who draw the sword will die by the sword." And here's the verse I want us to hear. "Do you think I cannot call on my Father, and he will at once put at my disposal more than 12 legions of angels?" God does not lack for firepower. Even at the moment of his betrayal, Jesus is telling his disciples, "Look, I've got 1 legion for each one of you on call. 5,000 men, 5,000 angels for each disciple, 12 legions." He could have that, 60,000 angels. It's not that God lacks for firepower. It's not that he lacks for might. You know, we're used to we come here for the last 4 weeks and all we hear about is a holy infant so tender and mild that we forget that same infant had vast legions of angels at his beck and call, and more power than that even. Now, here's how the early American evangelist Jonathan Edwards put it. Jonathan Edwards was a Puritan. He was part of something called the First Great Awakening of religious fervor in American history. And on July 8th, 1741, he gave what has become a classic sermon called "Sinners in the Hands of an Angry God." Now compare this to some of that holy, infant, and tender, and mild stuff you've been hearing. So this is what John Edwards had to say to his congregation. "There is no want of power in God to cast wicked men into hell at any moment. Men's hands cannot be strong when God rises up. The strongest have no power to resist him, nor can any deliver out of his hands. He is not only able to cast wicked men into hell, but he can most easily do it. Sometimes an earthly prince meets with a great deal of difficulty to subdue a rebel who has found means to fortify himself and has made himself strong by the numbers of his followers, but it is not so with God. There is no fortress that is any defense from the power of God. Though hand join in hand and vast multitudes of God's enemies combine and associate themselves, they are easily broken in pieces. They are as great heaps of light chaff before the whirlwind, or large quantities of dry stubble before devouring flames. We find it easy to tread on and crush a worm that we see crawling on the earth. So it is easy for us to cut or singe a slender thread that anything hangs by. Thus easy is it for God when he pleases to cast his enemies down into hell. What are we that we should think to stand before him at whose rebuke the earth trembles, and before whom the rocks are thrown down. Whom are we indeed? Now, he goes on like that for about another 20 pages. And I mean like that. It's just, but do you get a sense from that? I mean, I think that's useful for something we tend to forget, which is just the awesome power of God. And that when we turn right and he says left, and we do that all the time, we prefer a dead end, when we prefer Rome to home, isn't it useful to sometimes remember the mighty power of God and where we stand in relationship to that power? So why, when God is confronted with Rome, whether it's ancient Rome or the Romes we set up every day, he was confronted with Rome, which was oppressing his chosen people, why is it an infant that gets sent? Why isn't it legions of angels? We deserve the legions of angels. When we sin and rebel, when we choose to go the opposite direction, when we prefer that dead end, why is that Savior still there for us? Why is that infant there when God offers us home and we choose Rome? And I think that's an important question, and I think the answer is this. With legions, you would almost certainly get obedience, but you wouldn't get holiness. God desires more than our obedience. God desires that we be in relationship with him. God became flesh so flesh could become holy. Where have we heard that in the last week? Full credit to Fred Vanderwerf. God became flesh so flesh could become holy. God sent Jesus to save us, not to conquer us, even though it is clear that he could easily conquer, that we deserve to be conquered because what we need is to be saved. And as such, the only thing he wants to conquer is our hearts. And I would, of course, like to read from the book of Romans. And I'll be reading from chapter 5, verses 6 through 8. And I wanted to read the Message translation this morning because I just love the way it puts this verse. And this is a common verse. You've probably all memorized it at some point. I wouldn't be surprised if our confirmands are memorizing it. But here's how the Message puts it. Christ arrives right on time to make this happen. He didn't and doesn't wait for us to get ready. He presented himself for this sacrificial death when we were far too weak and rebellious to do anything to get ourselves ready. And even if we hadn't been so weak, we wouldn't have known what to do anyway. We can understand someone dying for a person worth dying for, and we can understand how someone good and noble could inspire us to selfless sacrifice. But God put his love on the line for us by offering his Son in sacrificial death while we were of no use whatever to him. Christ died for us while we were yet sinners. That proves his great love for us, is the other way that's typically translated. We get an infant Savior because our Father is willing to put his love on the line for us, even though we prefer Rome to home. It's all about love. It's about a love so deep and incredible that we struggle to comprehend it, and yet there it is. It's the reason why we're here. It's the reason why we're here for the third or fourth time this week, is that love. Have you accepted that love? Have you met that child one-on-one? Has your own heart been conquered? And it is so important that you accept the real gift of Christmas. It's important for you. It can make all the difference in your life, but it's also important for those around you. They need to know that love. They need to turn from their own personal Romes. You see, God has a plan to conquer the empires of Blue Earth and Nicollet counties. He has an invasion force ready for southern Minnesota and northern Iowa, an expeditionary unit that's ready to step off. And who knows where they might go from there, but that force led by that infant is you. The people of Hilltop United Methodist Church, we're called to love the socks off those around us so that they can come to understand that great gift of love that God has for them. I love that expression, love their socks off. We hear that a lot around Hilltop United Methodist Church lately. And do you know where that phrase comes from? The original phrase is, well, I'm going to knock your socks off. And it means I'm going to hit you with so much force that you'll be lifted up to literally drop your socks off. So, of course, Mythbusters did a study. Mythbusters did a study and determined that there's only one kind of force that can literally knock your socks off, and that is explosive force. And they determined that it's probably a myth. Probably nobody ever actually had their socks knocked off because of the amount of explosive force that it takes to knock someone's socks off. But do you know how much force it takes to love someone's socks off? It takes just exactly that much. And we're not capable of that on our own, but that's okay, because God chose to conquer with an infant that would go on to show us the kind of love it takes to have our socks loved off, and to show us how to love the socks off those around us. So we're kind of on the edge of that year where we're looking at the new year, and there's going to come a point, and it'll either be New Year's Eve when you ring it in, it'll be New Year's Day when you wake up, or it'll be the first time you try to write a check with 2013 and you write 2012. There's going to come a moment where you get that the new year has passed and you've crossed over into that border. The earth is ready to take another transit around the sun. And in that moment, just take that moment and relish it for just a second and use it as a time to just lay your heart on that altar of God and say, thank you for conquering me with an infant. Thank you for sending Jesus when it could have been, maybe should have been legions of angels. And accept that gift. Say, Jesus, I get it. I'm going to start the new year, and I'm just going to take that as a moment to say, you can have my heart. You made it. And now I'll give it back to you, because that's the only thing that infant came to conquer. But he came just exactly ready to do just that. So let's be empowered to do that. Let's surrender our heart to the child who came to conquer it, and know that that's God's plan for you, and it's God's plan for the people around you. Amen.